Sherene Seikaly is Associate Professor of History at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She's the editor of a number of academic journals, including the Journal of Palestine Studies. She's also a policy member of Al-Shabaka and the Palestinian Policy Network. As a historian of capitalism, consumption, and development in the modern Middle East, she has an overriding concern with how individuals, groups, and governments use concepts and material practices to shape the body, the self, and the other. We're at a point now where the death toll in Gaza has climbed to more than 30,000 people, and yet we still can't expect an end to the merciless genocidal attack on Palestinians by the Netenyahu regime in Israel anytime soon. A team of researchers from the London School of Hygiene and Johns Hopkins University just released a report called Crisis in Gaza: Scenario-Based Health Impact Projections that says we can still save thousands of lives by establishing a ceasefire that would allow the delivery of humanitarian aid as Gaza is throttled by Israel. It describes the situation by saying that, quote, in case of a ceasefire now, we would be saving around 75,000 lives. That means that a continuation of the military assault on Rafa will lead to a humanitarian catastrophe at an unimaginable scale. So, in this terrifying moment, I spoke with Sherene Seikaly about her sense of the roots of this overwhelming, punishing violence in colonial logics of dehumanization. It comes from, she says, civilizational hierarchies that have already been established to secure colonial relations and render whole populations basically disposable. It also comes from silencing and denial. In Sherene's words, there's been a repression of people calling for Palestinian liberation that allows the untold horror to keep happening without the resistance and rage that could end it. For a long time, we've been in a situation where knowledge itself, she says, has become a target of war. This epistemicide means there's no relationship between politics and the truth. In Israel, there's a tacit encouragement of the genocide by American imperialists and the agenda of those that believe in this partnership between the United States and Israel in the region. It's a thing that lets the US continue arming Israel with no conditions whatsoever. But this obscuring of the reality of genocide and the jubilation with which settlers are making Gaza unlivable is forcing Sherene, she says, to question everything that she thought she knew about the world or the notion of a rules-based international order. So, we talk about her book, Men of Capital, which is a brilliant and untold history of the Arab world through the lens of Palestinian statehood. She says that, quote, maps are actually violent processes of colonial and state formation and fundamentally constructions in her kind of description of that book. She explains why Palestine contains an abundance of lessons about the future we're heading toward. But we start with the question of the Palestinian child, the eviction of Palestinian people from the category of the human, and the specter of a violence that aims to erase generations of Palestinian people that have not had a chance at a life. So, I just wanted to welcome you, obviously, in, incredibly dire times, like just overwhelming times where, the death toll is almost certainly much higher than Israel wants people to believe, right? The official number of Palestinians killed since October 7th is, I believe, 27,000, which is itself a staggering number, but it is likely a conservative estimate. There's an estimated 7,000 to 8,000 people missing. So it's unbelievable. And I think that's part of the problem. It's difficult for people to fathom. And so I wanted to begin with the question of children, especially, and the reality of the sheer number of Palestinian children who have died. The number is itself, shocking. Over 11,000 children. It's just, yeah, it's too much to bear. And there's been attempts to communicate how, like, what that means. For example, UN Security General Antonio Guterres said that Gaza is becoming a graveyard for children. UNICEF spokesperson James Elder said that he's running out of ways to describe the horrors hitting children there. So I think, like, that is itself telling, right? That he's running out of ways of kind of articulating it. And yeah, I just wondered if you wanted to kind of speak to why you think communicators keep coming back to this point in their pleas for ceasefire and their, demands for an end to occupation, maybe. Like, why do you think the figure of the Palestinian child in particular is sort of central to the campaign of exposing the Zionist regime's genocidal intent?
Thank you so much, Scott, and thank you for your real close engagement and taking seriously the work of Palestinian knowledge producers and creators. It means everything to all of us. I wanted to say the place that I follow for the most accurate numbers, in case that's helpful. Every morning I go to Mondowise, actually, which records, what day we're in. So we're in day 133 of this genocide now, which in and of itself is, as you say, beyond fathomable. And if you do go to Mondoweiss, they actually are building on the numbers from the Gaza Ministry of Health on their Telegram channel. And they also follow different rights groups who put the estimates at higher numbers. So the numbers as we know them today are 28,775 Palestinians killed in Gaza. At least 12,000 of these people are children. Over 68,552 Palestinians have been injured. It's also important to remember the 394 Palestinians who have been killed in the occupied West Bank since October 7. That number is important to keep in mind because before October 7, observers were talking about the way we were all talking about the ways that 2023 had been the bloodiest year on record, with over 220 Palestinians killed by Israeli soldiers and settlers in the West Bank that year. Unfortunately, Israel has a way of reiteratively breaking its own records. And of course, I think it is always important to remember and name the now 1,147 Israelis who were killed by Hamas on October 7. I want to, before I get to your question about the child, I want to get to also relay the kind of pain that it entails to be not only in this constant grief, but also be gaslit about it. And so one of the things that Joe Biden did from the very beginning was to play along with the most vulgar propaganda coming out of the Israeli state machine, and including questioning our very count of the dead. And here, and I know we'll get a chance to talk more about this in the coming hour, but it's crucial to remember that this is a U.S. war as much as it is an Israeli war on Palestine. So the figure of the child, I think it's so important to concentrate on this. And I think in a way, the child is really the embodiment of the most innocent actor that you could imagine. And I think from the very beginning, we were subject to, and here by we, I'll go back and forth in who that we is, because I hold, like most people, multiple subject positions. And I am a Palestinian and I'm also a US citizen. And I think all of us who aren't in Gaza looking on, from the very beginning were very clear on the ways that Israeli officials were attempting to take Palestinians out of the category of the human. And this is a technology that is very familiar to people who study racialization, genocide, massacre, slavery, the history of anti-Blackness in the United States, the transatlantic slave trade, the Armenian genocide, the Shoah, the Holocaust, on, right? This eviction from the category of the human, this discussion of Palestinians as human animals, right? That there are no innocents, there are no civilians in Gaza. This kind of, promise of and of the Gaza Nakba. And I think what's really important too about the figure of the child is that the child is also the vehicle for the future.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the child is the most difficult to exclude from the category of the human. And I think so many of us have been, I know for myself, I won't speak for anyone else but myself. For me, the images of the shredded children, or the children mourning the loss of their parents, or the Dunya who lost her entire family and then lost her leg and then lost her life. And it's this kind of evisceration of the child that is so deeply painful, because of what it means for that the attempt to erase the generations to come, because of what it means for us to look at this kind of shattered innocence, and also what it means to balance the betrayal that one feels to look on and the betrayal that one feels to look away. It's all of those things happening at once. And I think what's really important to keep in mind here is that this did not start on October 7th. There has been a long strategy within Israeli settler colonialism, specifically targeting the question of the child. And Nadira Shahab-Kevorkian has called this unchilding in her book, Incarcerated Childhood and the Politics of Unchilding. And what she's referring to with this term is this kind of authorized eviction of children from childhood for political goals. And she, reveals how this pattern is maintained by, violent, racist, sexist, and classist machinery. And so here, I think it's important to also keep in mind the number of children under Israeli imprisonment. Right now, if you go to Defense for Children International Palestine, you'll find that there are 23 children under administrative detention, 156 children that are security detainees. And according to Defense for Children International, and here I'm quoting, each year approximately 500 to 700 Palestinian children, some as young as 12 years old, are detained and prosecuted in the Israeli military court system. And the most common charge is stone throwing. And so this is part of a broader story of the kinds of how imprisonment has been since 1967 so central to Palestinian life. And in the numbers that we do have include an estimated 800,000 Palestinians who have gone through this imprisonment system. And so I think it's really important to understand those numbers and the role of the child in this process of unchilding within all of that. And there, I think another thing to keep in mind is the way that and Julie Petit, an anthropologist of Palestine, has written quite beautifully about this, the way that, especially during the first uprising which was not the first uprising, but the Intifada, the
Mhm.
first uprising under Israeli military occupation in the West Bank that began in 1987. During this time, we see these huge numbers of children and youth who make it through the Israeli prison system without habeas corpus, of course, and she charts the way that this also becomes a kind of rite of passage, right? The changing meaning of what it means to be a
Right.
Palestinian youth. So I think those are really, really important, to think about what this kind of means socially.
Yeah.
Um, I want to just sort of end here with what I think is a really crucial point, which is that the target of Israeli force and U.S. supplied weapons in this genocide, any honest observer understands, is the civilian. Hamas combatants are the collateral damage of this genocide. And there, as we know, there are no safe zones in the Gaza Strip. What has remained as the final standing city of Rafa is now, the Israelis have starved and cut off all kinds of basic needs from water to electricity to any
Mhm.
kind of life-giving sustenance. And
Right.
I think if the global calls for ceasefire are finally heeded, Israeli and U.S. citizens alike are going to have to come to terms with their support and funding of a genocide that
Mhm.
basically targeted children. We know that
Exactly.
they've made up 40% of this relentlessly climbing death toll, and I think that those children are going to haunt all of us. And I also just want to say in the end, and here I want to quote the words of the youth-led Palestinian nonprofit project in the Gaza Strip. We are not numbers. I think the we are not numbers reminds us that, the poetry and beauty of these youth and these children and their dreams and hopes that are now lying under the rubble will live on despite the effort to annihilate them.
Hmm. Yeah, that is, an incredible account of what's at stake in human terms with the escalating death toll. And you mentioned the incursion into Rafa, you know the just the unbelievable encroachment on the last remaining place. There is no safe place in Gaza, but the last remaining refuge in Gaza, and the kind of crisis that represents. It's only at this point that governments like the Canadian government. I'm in the settler colonial state of Canada myself. It's only now tens of thousands of innocent dead into this war on Gaza that they have decided to call for a ceasefire, aligning at least with the ICJ's demand for some sort of humanitarian allowance. Um, but this argument that you've made reminds me that Israel's policy of occasionally, as they call it, mowing the lawn, when the population reaches a point of unruly size and radicalization, does target children. It does target generation itself, in Gaza. And yet at the same time, I think this idea that those children must be mourned, they will be mourned, is such a kind of radical assertion against the kind of like logic of denying humanity. Seeing Palestinians as only, as Rebecca Stein puts it, like legitimate targets. Um, but Jeremy Scahill talked recently about this in terms of the kind of propaganda campaign that Israel has waged since October 7th, which is almost exclusively in some ways, sort of advertised this idea that Hamas and the groups that it kind of led on October 7th were inhuman because of their violence to children, right? And there's no sense of the obvious hypocrisy of Israel and its allies in the United States kind of promoting this fiction that there was this kind of barbarism waged against the children of Israel. It was entirely a fabrication, all of it. And one, Scahill says, was designed to, the way he puts it, is sell the worst crime against humanity in modern times in order to justify a long planned siege of Gaza. Right? It was violence against children that allowed this annihilation, or the story of violence against children that allowed this annihilation to occur in a lot of ways. So what then happens in the aftermath of the grieving that's happening in Palestine and for Palestine, and for Palestine's children in particular? I don't know.
I do want to add, like you were saying about Canada now finally finding enough dignity. And here I want to distinguish between governments and their peoples, because we
Right.
know that the peoples on the streets from all across Canada
Mm-hmm.
have been calling for an end to this genocide. I think it's also important to remember that in the wake of this, brave and righteous case put forward by South Africa at the ICJ, that not only did these governments take part in continuing to fund and arm Israel with impunity, but they also decided to defund the UNRWA, the
Yeah.
United Nations Relief and Works Agency, the literal last remaining lifeline for Palestinians in the Gaza Strip.
Yeah.
So
Which is part
it's
of the
it's
plan, right? This is the other part of it, right? That I was watching Scahill report on this. The story from Israel is that 12 out of 30,000 UNRWA workers that were operating in Palestine were complicit in October 7th. And they claim that there are tunnels under the building, under the UNRWA, and immediately, without verifying any of those reports, funding is withdrawn. 90% of the population of Gaza relies on humanitarian aid for like these basic necessities. So it is absolutely disgusting and an attempt to strangle a people. And I don't know that it is being understood that way. There's a war happening that is about like the war for the truth of this
right,
struggle.
right, right, right. Well, I mean, we see this with the kind of abject denialism of figures within the Democratic Party, Nancy Pelosi, and
Yeah.
just that you're all China and you're all Russians when she's talking about the pro Palestine solidarity, or the like immense repression against people calling for Palestinian liberation. And
Mhm.
I think there's a parallel here that we might think about as we try and imagine a different tomorrow, which is, it's always so striking to me, and I think Hala Alian, the poet, talked about this, this figure of the Palestinian, this impoverished, um, oppressed, occupied subject,
Mhm.
who is the source of such immense threat,
Yeah.
that is, in a way, parallel to what we see around the ways that within, Turtle Island, United States, North America, the kinds of policing around criticism of Israel and its escalation that we have seen in the last decade,
Mhm.
that position the most vulnerable as the most at fault. And I think what we have to, as we think forward about our strategies, and like I said, the very potential for a different tomorrow, we have to be able to kind of um, think through that the fear that we inspire is reveals the weakness of the people who have power over us.
Mhm. Mhm. Absolutely. And I think like that point has certainly been made within sort of post-colonial studies, to some extent, that there is a way in which the kind of like internalizing of these colonial logics is something that kind of like permanently fractures like your own humanity. Like there's something that's compromised in you by it. And I think like there's
Absolutely.
tons of power in that sort of theoretical framework for understanding these asymmetries, right, of power.
Absolutely. I mean,
Um,
on
yeah.
on that point, I don't know if you saw this came out on Twitter that they were talking about and documenting a feature that came out in Haaretz Hebrew
Mm.
that had a cooking show feature about Israeli soldiers as they are living in the homes of Palestinians in Gaza and cooking in their
Oh yeah.
kitchens with their food. And
I
it's
saw
like,
that.
while people are starving, while
Mm.
people are emaciated, and deprived
Hmm.
for months, and exactly as you said, this what this means for how we understand ourselves globally. What does it mean that there are groups of Israelis who are mobilizing on the border of Gaza to make sure that the no humanitarian aid gets in? It's, to me, it's those kinds of moments that really make me question everything that I know.
Yeah, absolutely. Honestly, it's hard not to go there.
Yeah.
And I was just reading a book called Petrochemical Planet by Alice Ma, and she begins with that kind of acknowledgement that like you want to maintain this kind of humanist, vitalist ideal, right? That we're all capable of recognizing how apathetic, callous, and inhumane we're being. But then there are these things, these forms of like normalized terror that remind you that actually, like, there might be something like evil in the world. And it's evil is notions of innocence and evil. These are obviously fraught terms, but these are terms that I think we sort of as people who are trying to decode and decipher what's happening are forced to confront. And you've served as an editor of the Journal of Palestine Studies for almost a decade and have written extensively in that journal. There's one essay that kind of jumped out at me, which is kind of a retrospective, where you talk about how the journal did not simply feature war; it actually like emanated from it. That to me is like a different idea of what of an academic journal does, right? That it is not there to just discuss war, um, to make it an object of analysis. It is at war. And like, I wondered if you could just sort of speak to what that means for you and what role you see writing playing um, to resist this kind of, this slippage into just total war in Gaza.
And the piece that you're talking about, it's called "In the Shadow of War," and it came out to commemorate the 50-year anniversary of the Journal of Palestine Studies, which is the flagship journal in the English language in the field. And what I did was I was trying to find a way to commemorate this journal. I basically was trying to look through titles,
Mm.
and
Mhm.
I tried to trace the title of the word war as it showed up across time, across the 50 years. And it showed up so much that I could only ultimately do the first 2 decades. And one of the things that I was really trying to do in that work of tracing sort of the shifts in the field and what it meant, and its class politics and its gender politics and all of the things like in every field that we struggle with and question and challenge and are born of. What I was also trying to do was to think about the archive. And this is something that is really central to my own research and my own ways of thinking, which is about how do we understand an archive
Mhm.
and archives, in a context where there is no one official state archive,
Right.
and in a context in which every single Palestinian, every single Israeli attack on Palestine or the Palestinians has targeted archives. It's crucial for people to understand how knowledge in this last genocide itself has become a target of war. We know that 70% of Gaza schools have been reduced to rubble. We know that Israel has obliterated Gaza Central archives, burned 150 years worth of documents, archival materials. We know that Israel has destroyed every single one of Gaza's universities, as well as destroying the entire cultural landscape: 76 cultural centers, theaters, 3 theaters, 5 museums, 15 publishing houses and bookstores, 80 public libraries, over 200 heritage sites, right? Gaza is 4,000 years old. It has an incredible array of heritage sites that dotted the Gaza Strip's cultural landscape that are now destroyed. What we, what we're watching alongside this genocide is epistemicide, right? This policy that's mandating the destruction of cultural and historic sites, libraries, bookstores, and is very intentionally killing educators. We know that over 94 educators have been killed. We know that at this point, the numbers of journalists, every day Israel targets journalists. Every day they are targeting, the very people who are telling the story. So if we step back, I think one of the things that's so important to do in political work and in imagining ourselves to be part of movements, and imagining what movements are to be, is to balance humility with also acknowledging what it is that we do. And I think humbly what I would say is that writing our histories, writing our present, writing writing Palestinian studies, guarding the possibility of that study, is itself a really important act of resistance.
Hmm. I had no idea that the cultural erasure, what you call epistemicide, was so extensive. I had no idea. Um,
And I mean, not only that, but this has such a long history. So, for example, in 1982, when Israel invades Lebanon, they target the PLO archive there. That PLO archive is now in Israeli university libraries. In 1948, there's a film called The Great Book Robbery that documents these processes. In 1948, it is kind of long documented that people's personal records would actually wind up in places like the Hebrew University Library, that people's libraries, their entire book collections, right?
hmm,
So if you are a US citizen like myself, and I did a lot of my research uh, at the Israel State Archive, um, where the documents that are um, Palestinian documents are all basically categorized under a label of abandoned properties and documents.
hmm,
So it's this language of abandonment, right,
hmm,
that erases actually the confiscation and the archival violence
yeah.
that has been at the very foundation of Israel's settler colonial project.
Hmm. Yeah, as though there, yeah, that it was a land without a people for people without a land. This kind of original rejection of the very existence of
Mhm.
Palestinians. What you describe feels like a war on the past, present, and future
Absolutely.
of
Absolutely.
Palestine. And this is also, of course, what the journal is engaging with, right? It's it's
Absolutely.
it's a venue that's had all of these like really remarkable interventions, and I think it's important too to think about like the connection between this indigenous group and the land, right? Like the in terms of the health and the environmental impacts of the occupation, you've got an article where you talk about the false notion that the environment is separate from technology and other human constructions and waste. Like that needs to be pointed out. I really responded to the idea that ecologies are constituted out of infrastructures. That is true across the board, especially as Darren Barney puts it, like when settler colonialism kind of manifests as infrastructure. Um, you know, and we're in this moment now, of course, of like climate emergency, of climate catastrophe, and it does strike me that you've got regimes like the one in Israel or Russia or Saudi Arabia, elsewhere, that are willing to, embark on these campaigns of military aggression, encroachment, um, without any regard for the ecological impact. Right? It's not even registered, because there are obviously more, in a way, I guess, pressing or immediate or salient aspects of the annihilation happening. But you're also annihilating the environment. You write that logics of scarcity drive some of these conflicts. That this is the kind of force of elimination, as you put it, and the relationship between that and like exploitation. But what's interesting to me is that you're talking about how water, especially, is like this unbelievably scarce resource, that's sometimes also a source of like social organization and radicalization. Did you want to talk at all about how this can be brought to bear on the struggle for survival in Gaza? Palestine will be free from the river to the sea. Those are things that invoke this idea, right, of like being bordered by water. Why should we be focusing on water, as much as we are on the carnage here?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the question of land and water in this way are really beautifully interconnected. And I'll start by saying that, one of the really important lessons that Indigenous studies gives us, and this is something that my dear friend and colleague Rana Barakat, who's at Birzeit University, sort of invites us to think about, to ask the question, not who does the land belong to, but to insist that we belong to her. And I think we can make that same kind of insistence for the water. And for I guess now, I mean, sometimes you look back on your own work and you think, oh, I've been worried about this for a while. And I think living in California has meant a kind of constant confrontation with climate catastrophe,
Mhm.
and its temporalities. And so I've been thinking about climate catastrophe and Palestine together for many years now. And I think you're absolutely right that, Israeli and US officials often depict Gaza as this kind of island, right? As sort of floating in isolation historically, and
Mhm.
floating in isolation from, the rest of Palestine and the rest of the world. And really, nothing could be further from the truth, because, in fact, the genocide in Gaza is really actually really concretely intensifying this age of global boiling, that we are in right now. And so here it's useful to remember that 2023 was the hottest year on record,
Mhm.
and that, in November 2023, and for the first time ever, global temperatures had reached 2 degrees Celsius above pre industrial rates. It might be good to remember that 2023 was the year of the Hawaii wildfires that, devastated Lahaina, the year of extreme flooding in Rwanda and Congo, a
Mhm.
cyclone in Malawi, devastating earthquakes,
Mhm.
Morocco, Afghanistan, Turkey, Syria, earth shattering flooding and storms in Libya. And this list is by no means exhaustive. For me, within all of this, we kind of can look to Palestine, not as an object of sympathy or fear or even salvation, but as a kind of paradigm about how do we survive this age of catastrophe. And here I want to say, um, that the first 60 days of this war alone burned at least 150,000 tons of coal. And this kind of environmental catastrophe is beyond what we might imagine. And as we know, experts have used satellite data to actually map the damage, and they have shown that the genocide has changed the land itself. The Gaza Strip is now a different color from space than it used to be. It's a different texture. And so, as we had said earlier, it's really important to remember that this is a U.S. war as much as it is an Israeli war. It's important to remember that since 1948, the U.S. has gifted Israel more than $260 billion, mostly in military aid, that this does not include the $14.3 billion that Biden pledged to Israel in November, that the kinds of artillery that Israel is using, from the 2,000-pound bunker busters that have targeted Palestinians to the U.S.-made joint direct attack munitions that turn earth into liquid and render instant death to anyone within 100 feet of the bomb's impact. All of these artillery and these billions of dollars granted by the United States in 2023 alone contribute to this generalized state of climate catastrophe in which we all live. And so the waste of this war, from carbon to white phosphorus, will live on for generations in the soil, in the earth, in our very bodies. And so, this it's like the parliamentarian who said, "Oh, we should nuke Gaza." The Israeli parliamentarian, and I don't know if he forgot how close Gaza was to Israel, right? So it's this kind of, in fact, our destinies are absolutely interlinked, and we also know the kind of releasing of salt water into Israel releasing salt water into Gaza's tunnels, which will essentially entirely degrade all of Gaza's lands to such an extent that it will become unlivable. But the thing about it is, if you're rendering life unlivable in a place that is so close to where you actually live, that is going to have influence on you. And nothing that you do in Gaza is isolated from what is happening to the rest of the world. And so I think it's that kind of hubris that is very difficult to make sense of, because at the end of the day, we're all going to have to reside on this earth together. And so I think, there is a way to think about all of these cascading disasters as of a piece, right?
Yeah. They are, as you say, of a piece. I think, like, what you're seeing in the wastelanding of Gaza is a sort of leaching of that cruelty into the land,
Yes.
that is entirely dependent on this, like, bordered thinking, this, like, thinking that is entirely about the kind of sanctity of borders, that, yeah, as Scahill says, ignores the fact that Israel cannot live in peace a stone's throw away from what is effectively a concentration camp filled with 2.3 million people that are deprived of anything vaguely resembling a human existence. That is not tenable. Um, and yet, this kind of bordered thinking, so to speak, makes it, operate in this kind of place of metastasis, I guess, for Israel, right? That within the boundaries of Israel, the story that Israel tells itself is that that is sustainable, right? And that, to me, is the terrifying thing. But I do think, like, you've made a number of powerful statements alongside, for example, some co-authors about, the question of queering Palestine too, for example, like this this is itself kind of a discourse that I think is really rich when it comes to trying to explore where you know what you call misconceptions themselves that endanger the struggle for liberation, right? So there are these misconceptions about sort of queer politics or queer possibilities in Palestine, and certainly Israel likes to see itself as the only democracy in the Middle East, or a particularly progressive liberal society, and that makes it more human, perhaps, like according to the sort of Western Eurocentric optic. Um, but what you're saying in this piece is that a queer politics can actually subvert certain notions of sovereignty. Like it can subvert bordered thinking, binary thinking, that obviously we're seeing creates this serious issue when it comes to imagining alternative futures. So I wondered if you could kind of talk about why so often Zionist policies and discourse, I'm quoting the piece, Zionist policies and discourses portray Palestinian aspirations for freedom as incompatible with queer rights and freedoms. But at the same time, you write, Palestinian nationalist discourses do demand sexual conformity and look at LGBTQ rights as undermining Palestinian identity and unity. So, like, that itself is sort of an impasse. Why might finding a way to resolve that impasse be important for finding a path to liberation?
Thank you. I'll say two things. I mean, I think we can follow the lead of queer liberation who say, queer as in free Palestine.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and I think, these voices from people like Jasbir Puar to
Oh, yeah.
Al-Qaus in Palestine, those organizers, many of the authors in this special issue that you talk about,
Hmm.
who really have tried to relay, how do we center both queer liberation and Palestinian liberation as mutually kind of constituting. And I think here, I think there was an Israeli soldier who um, proudly was carrying or pitching the rainbow flag on the beach in Gaza and saying, "No, for the first time, we have pride in Gaza." And queer commentators and organizers say, there's no pride in genocide. There's no pride in settler colonialism.
Right.
So I think the questions around pinkwashing, right?
Yeah.
There's the Israeli policy of saying, we are a safe haven for queer people, and look at the barbarism of these, Palestinians, and it's often in deeply Islamophobic terms.
Hmm.
Is a kind of tried and true strategy that is really relying on civilizational hierarchies to again exclude people from the category of the human.
Hmm. Hmm.
So that's saying that part. The second part that's kind of informs my own political and work and my research is, how is it that we kind of refuse the epistemological trap that we're often put in as people who are colonized and writing the history of the colonized, in which we are often centering the colonizer and the settler as the origin and the ends of politics. And I think
Hmm.
in order to imagine liberation, we have to decenter some of that and begin asking the questions about our own political formations, about the racism, the sexism, the classism, the homophobia that punctuate our own histories and our past and our present. I think for too long, colonized people often felt like, well, if we engage those questions, then we're actually proving the colonizer right. So we'll deal with all those questions after liberation.
Hmm.
You can't deal with those questions after. You can't defer those questions. You have
Hmm.
to deal with them in the present. And I think, of course, there are, in the midst of the urgency of genocide, we're not going to be necessarily centering questions of this sort. But I think the work has to constantly be centering what do we understand as freedom for all. And I think that kind of work in the medium and the long term necessitates asking the difficult questions about ourselves, and remembering that, even if there were no, even if in some magical counter reality there was no colonialism, it wouldn't be that we would be living in nirvana right now, right? We have to kind of engage those hierarchies of civilization, and all of the structures of exclusion that we ourselves are engaged in. And for me, that has always entailed a thoroughgoing critique of the nation state as a structure and a source of ideology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I talked to Ingrid Waldron, who's African Canadian sort of expert, I guess you'd say, or leading voice in environmental racism. And what she says in her book, "There's Something in the Water," is that there are all these boundary making projects that constitute social hierarchies that themselves are like at the root of so much of the violence that racialized people, let's say, experience. So
Yeah.
sovereignty is central to that, the kind of perpetuation of that, the normalizing of it, I think. And so it makes sense to continually come back to that. And I think maybe it makes sense to talk about your book, Men of Capital, here, right? Like, this is a book that theorizes sort of the relationship between Palestinian identity to notions of the state. You write in that book that given the widely scattered realities of Palestinians, the continued siege and occupation of Gaza, the occupation of the West Bank, and the persistence of statelessness, it's compelling to search the Palestinian historical record for what went wrong. But in such a search, it's almost inevitable that nationalism, its lack, its strength, or its weakness, will stand as a metonym for politics. So it feels like you're saying like you're trying to do a diagnosis, like what went wrong, and you see at the core of it like the state. And I think like the question you ask in the book about why invoking the idea of the state has to be the precondition for politics is just really, really crucial. You're basically asking why statehood must always be what you call the measuring stick for whether people can remain where they are. Um, you know, it can be too abstract though. Like even when I'm talking about boundary making projects and the creation of social hierarchies, I think like you can lose people in the abstraction of it. But in the case of the question of Palestine, like it's inescapable, it's material, it's about life or death. So why do you keep coming back to it? Is perhaps the question.
Um, well, thank you again. I mean, I'll step back to just say, um, a couple things about the book Men of Capital, which is that the book is primarily an engagement with a group of actors who have been erased by both the settler colonial historiography and the nationalist historiography. The settler
Mhm.
colonial historiography, as you have laid out, land without a people, people without a land,
Mhm.
right? The Zionist mantra, the kind of civilizational narratives, the backward Arabs, the people outside of history, etc.
Mhm.
That will be more familiar to our listeners. The nationalist historiography also basically depicted a pre-48 Palestine that was peopled by either like an honorable but ignorant peasantry versus this kind of decadent,
Mhm.
selfish nobility.
Mhm.
And what my book does is said, no, there's a whole group of people in the middle. And this group of people were thinking about profit and progress as intimately linked. They called themselves men of capital and women of thrift. They were this nascent middle class. They were really invested in profit and capital accumulation. So why tell that history? For a couple of reasons. One is because I think it's really important for people to understand, apropos getting out of colonized kind of epistemological traps, is that capitalist transformation in most of the world was taking place even before European presence and dominance, right? So capitalist transformation throughout most of the world, but especially the Eastern Mediterranean and North Africa, is happening through the commercialization of agriculture, not through industrialization. So there was already a land market in Palestine before European influence increases the tension around this kind of broad scale process of large plantations being owned by absentee urban landlords, such that the actual people who lived on the land were not the people who were selling the land. And that process is happening throughout the Middle East and North Africa. What is that? Why does that matter? Well, it matters because we have to understand what are the intellectual traditions and formations of our own social landscapes that have been informed by capitalism. So one of the findings of the work is that, we tend to think of Pan-Arabism as inextricable from Gamal Abdel Nasser's more socialist project in the 1950s, but the actors that I and many, many others have studied actually show a kind of Pan-Arab project that was contingent on understandings of capitalist utopia. So the idea here isn't simply to unearth, recover these stories, but rather to critique them. So that's part. So my contention is to say, perhaps we ought not to always look at what went wrong, but rather to also look at what actually was happening. Right. So that's one part. The second part is the question of the state. Okay. So you understood me absolutely correctly, which is that I'm saying people's rights to live on the land that they resided on for hundreds and hundreds of years should not be determined based on whether or not based on what boundaries national or imperial powers drew on a map. We know that maps are actually violent processes of imperial and colonial formation. We know that they are constructions on the territory itself. And I say this because one of the Zionist talking points will be to say, well, Palestinians never had sovereignty over the land and thus they don't exist as such, right? And I think here what's really important is to look at the kind of deeper history, not that deep, right? Which is the history of the mandatory rule that happens post World War I, where the British and the French are essentially British and French governments are essentially taking the spoils of World War I and taking over the colonies of the three empires that had met their demise: the German, the Austro-Hungarian, and the Ottoman. And it is in that uh, uh, distribution of the spoils of war that we see the constitutive contradiction of international law, in which there is all this lip service to self-determination, a concept long kind of celebrated as a creation of Woodrow Wilson that was in fact first introduced by Lenin. And so we know that longer story of those battles over utopic imaginaries. And what's important to understand about the mandatory rule is that it was a kind of thinly guised form of imperialism, of colonialism. The one thing that distinguished it from previous forms of imperialism was the promise of an eventual state. So what we're talking about here are the British and the French ruling the Eastern Mediterranean. We see the French are in what would become Syria and Lebanon. We see the British in Iraq, Transjordan, and Palestine. Mm-hmm. One of the things that's happening here is a politics of deferral. you will get so within the mandate document, what it actually says, and this is Article 22 of that document, which says, yes, these people they will eventually be able to be independent, but we're going to support them because they can't stand up on their own. So you see here an infantilization of the colonized subject. So all of this is happening in an area that people who, lived on these lands for years would understand as Greater Syria, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who people had experienced it as El Sham, right? So what the invitation here is to think beyond these kinds of 20th century boundaries is the only way to understand people's relationship to the land. The distinction between Palestine and the rest of these lands is that at no point in Palestine could the Palestinian Muslim and Christian majority actually have access to a state. Why? Well, because in 1917, the Balfour Declaration, which would later become the juridical infrastructure of British mandatory rule, essentially promised the British facilitation of the Jewish national home, while safeguarding, quote unquote, the rights, the civil and religious rights of the quote unquote non-Jewish people. What's happening here in the Balfour Declaration? Number one, Jewish becomes this ethno-national identity in Palestine.
Right.
And number two, the Palestinian Muslims and Christians become partitioned from Palestinian Jews, who are at this point 5% of the entire population. So what you see is a partition of people deserving versus undeserving of a state, people who have access to political rights and those who don't, right? So from the very beginning, the Balfour Declaration is premised on the denial of Palestinian political rights and the denial of a Palestinian peoplehood. So when Zionists use this mantra of a people without, a land without a people for a people without a land, they did not imagine that there were no Palestinians or people on the land. They said that those people were not a unified people, that they were not deserved, that they were a motley crew, undeserving of political rights, and that they could either be had for a price or moved without incident.
Yeah.
And more than 100 years later, the Palestinians have proved time and again that those estimations were false. And from its inception, Israel wanted to confiscate as much of the land with as few of the Palestinians on it as possible. And so what I'm trying to say here is I reject the formula that we don't exist as a people, because we had been, from the very inception of the modern nation state as we know it today, in this interwar era under colonial rule, was premised on the erasure of our peoplehood.
Yeah, I mean, that is so powerfully put. It's just, it conveys this idea that what we're talking about now is the outcome of a kind of colonial settler social engineering, right? Partitioning, dispossession, that like leads to the contemporary moment where the choices are unimaginably limited. Where, as Nadia Yakub said to me, you can disappear slowly, you can disappear quickly, or you can fight, right? And the other thing I learned from Men of Capital is that the war is not always just a kind of military campaign. It's not always an explosive, encroachment. It's also about like a kind of harnessing of the basic things of life, and the withdrawal of like calories. Like you read about calories as like a basic unit in some ways of dispossession. There's a moment where you talk about the British colonial government embarking on a series of attempts to count and regulate subjects and territories that used the calorie in the 1940s and the cost of living as technologies of rule in Palestine, which is like so striking, right? That it wasn't an obsession with numbers, you say, or a fascination with omniscience. It wasn't just biopolitical in that sort of demographic sense. It was biopolitical in the warlike, belligerent, racist sense, right? Of you say the fear of upheaval and the exigencies of war propelled them to action. This to me was like really illuminating this history of the kind of deliberate policy of starving and killing civilians in Gaza through these restrictions. What does it reveal and how does it connect to the current moment for you?
Great. So I want to go back to, because I think this is linked to this question. One of the things that's really, for me, always so compelling is to look at how policies like rationing or calorie counting influence and shape people across boundaries and temporalities. So when I was doing the research for this book, I was really shocked at the ways in which British policy resonated between how poor people were governed in London and how colonized people were governed in Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
So it's those comparable experiences that to me are really, really important in order for us to understand, again, a different kind of future. Let me explain what I mean by that.
Mm-hmm.
What you do as a historian is to take words and realize over time that they have histories. So, in the dissertation, I had really kind of taken this theme of the cost of living for granted,
Mm-hmm.
and then I started thinking, well, what is the history of the cost of living? And lo and behold, I found a relationship to um, mass political movements and their containment that I could not have imagined. The calorie is invented as a way of calculating energy in 1896 by someone named Wilbur Atwater. And this is important because it echoes with kind of the environmental scientists in the moment that we're living in. So what begins to happen at the turn of the century is this whole field of nutrition, where people are saying it's not how much you eat, but what you actually eat that really determines your well-being. And governments in London and the United States are really invested in denying these findings because they are worried about what it's going to mean for them having to give people the material support to eat well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so you see these entrenched battles around the science of nutrition. You see them in long hours of debate in the British Parliament. You see them in long kinds of struggles in the United States. So there's two breaking points in this history. One happens in the United States around the late 19th century, where scientists, nutritional scientists, make allies with business owners. Okay, so here we should watch out for, scientists are always a heterogeneous group, and there's always, people across the political spectrum. So we have to take that really seriously, right? We have to also be organizing alongside our scientist comrades and colleagues. And so a group of scientists join forces with business owners so that they can come up with something called the cost of living in the late 19th century, when the Communist Party in the United States is at its height, right? Something that might be very difficult for us to imagine at this point. And they come together and they say, okay, explain to us what is the base amount of food, of money people need to feed themselves so we can keep them on the factory floor and away from the street. And thus you see the cost of living emerge as a calculation of political containment.
Right.
In the United Kingdom, the calorie and the science of nutrition does not ascend until war makes it a necessity. So the British don't actually start using caloric intake and nutritional standards until World War II. And when they do it, they racialize it. They say, okay, well, if you are Asian, you don't need to eat as much because you're used to being outside and you're smaller and you have this race to body, and so it's this, and these racialized calculations come into the record in the League of Nations. So all of that to say two things. The calculations that make up what we understand as self-evident economic categories are ones we should question. That's one. Two, in order for us to imagine different futures, we have to study the ways that these calculations have been mobilized to keep different kinds of people down, whether it is communists in the United States or European Jewish people struggling against the Nazi genocidal fascism in the 1940s, or Palestinians in Gaza today. And so what you have, and this is actually something that begins in, just to get us to the present, which is, I think, and this is what you were mentioning that Netenyahu said, I think we have to look at the Israeli policy in Gaza as one that has been since 2007 with the election of Hamas, one of a very concerted politics of slow death that has been at warp speed since October 7th. And with the very in this moment of September 2007, when Hamas takes control of Gaza, the Israeli cabinet at that point was restricting the passage of goods, fuel, and people to and from the Strip. And they prepared in January 28th a document called the Red Lines, which prescribed the quote unquote humanitarian minimum of this policy. And basically, what the policy and the siege aimed for, in the words of Israeli officials, was to quote, allow for subsistence without the development of malnutrition. So it's keeping people just hungry enough, right? And so here, what we see is that eventually the quantities that were eventually cleared to enter were smaller than the quote unquote daily humanitarian portion of the Red Lines. And the aim, in the words of one of the officials of the Coordinator of Government Activities in the Territories, or COGAT, was quote, no prosperity, no development, no humanitarian crisis, end of quote. So it's this really long-standing starving of a people. And you see, if you look at some of the images of, I've been really fixated on, it's good we started with children, because I've been really fixated on saving videos and photographs of children making life amidst the certainty of death. And I've spent time looking at these children, and, they look small for their age. And it's because they have been under these decades of, that the entire Strip has been under decades of a rule of scarcity, intentional scarcity.
Right. Yeah. And, it's something that once you see it, you can't unsee it, nor should you want to. I did want to kind of, before we end, point to your short essay on the matter of time, right? Because it's something we've kind of circled around a number of times and talked about a bit. You write in that piece that today, Palestinians plan not for the future, but despite it. Given impending environmental doom, the significance of the matter of time and the insistence on planning despite the future might be useful lessons for us all. To me, like, just that has a lot of weight, and it doesn't just sort of reaffirm your knowledge, which listeners can tell how much you're just like engaging with this stuff, but also just this power to like articulate what you earlier called like an eviction from humanity. Like, that to me is what you're talking about here when you refer to the ways in which Palestinians are the children that you say, and trying to appreciate life in this kind of abyss of like violence. Like, if they imagine the future at all, they're doing it despite the kind of eviction from humanity and from the future. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't know if you wanted to kind of speak to what you were thinking about when you wrote that reflection, what you meant, I guess, in terms of, fighting against a future that is foreclosed in this moment.
What I mean by the in this piece, the matter of time, is I've been really kind of sort of immersed in thinking about the temporal rhythms of what it means to be both Palestinian and living in the modern era that we live in, or whatever we want to call this era. And I think, building on the things that we talked about before, I would say that since 1917, Palestinians have been really living under this kind of politics of deferral. What has been called in other contexts the waiting room of history. Wait until you're worthy enough to stand on your own 2 feet, right? And I think, whereas for the rest of greater Syria and Iraq, people would attain, even if in a very, albeit limited nation state form, Palestinians kind of remained in that politics of deferral, this permanent temporary, this politics of waiting, the way that settler time and its investment in a linear progressive future that is based on this kind of politics of extraction and denial, the way that it necessarily holds us in this permanent temporary. I mean, when I look at the kind of buffer zone that Egypt is building now in the Sinai, right, I'm filled with dread over what it might mean, to live in a corridor in a buffer zone in the Sinai desert. What I've learned from uplifting Palestinian voices and listening and learning from one another has been to say, well, perhaps we take this equation of settler time and look at the ways that, being in this condition of the permanent temporary, perhaps we can reframe all of this to understand Palestine as a place of an abundance of lessons. And the first lesson here is something that everyone might listen to, which is this reality that we don't that the crisis the rolling catastrophes that we're in have made it clear that we don't know what tomorrow will bring in our own country. I mean, you're in Canada, but in the United States, look at the coming year of what the political electoral scene looks like.
Mm-hmm.
Look at the levels of, climate catastrophe across Turtle Island, right? I have learned myself from just listening to everyday people in California who are now begun to mitigate their mitigate their faith in the inevitability of a better tomorrow. The students I teach and the students I'm honored to learn from know that things don't always get better. They live that reality. And so here I think that Palestine can teach us how to basically center the idea that we're going to live to fight another day. And that the kind of realities that we live in require that kind of day-to-day humility. And I think also, Palestine has a number of other lessons that it can offer us, and here I think is a really important lesson that's really crucial for us to center, which is that Palestine really brings together European nationalism's internal enemy and its external, or its internal victim and its external victim. And by its internal victim, I think it's really important for us to remember and honor the reality that anti-Semitism in Europe in the 19th century was based on this idea of racial science that categorized people as biologically irredeemable, that should be subject to the their eviction from humanity. We have seen what this looks like. We understand that racialization to be parallel to the colonization of Black and Brown people across the world. And we understand also that the racialization of Jewish people in Europe would lead to industrial scale genocide. And that genocide under Nazi rule was one that was honed in Central Africa, as the recently departed president of Namibia, Hygiene, reminded us after the historic ICJ ruling in South Africa's brave and righteous case therein. And here I want to say that Zionism, it's important to understand that Zionism was one response of many to this ubiquity of anti-Semitism in Europe, and that it would not become the most popular or the most prevailing response until the rise of Hitler to power in 1933. The tragedy of Zionism is that it was an attempt to exit from these European racializing practices that Cedric Robinson, the Black radical tradition, have traced, analyzed, and dismantled. But the tragedy of Zionism is that it's attempting to leave Europe to exit these hierarchies, but when it arrives to Palestine, it refashions them. So I think the first lesson that Palestine teaches us is to imagine freedom both against and beyond the framework of national territorial sovereignty, in the idea that our problem can't also always be our solution.
We need to figure out how to think and feel beyond the nation state.
Yep.
I 100% agree. And I concede that it feels like it's against all odds that we're making that imperative. But I don't care. Like I agree with the kind of oppositional spirit of that. And I don't care about the odds of it working. I think it's obviously at the root, and we need to be addressing this issue at like the root. And again, like I just think you're a very powerful speaker when it comes to trying to kind of connect these dots for people.
Thank you. Yeah. So, okay. Because I do think it's really important, this question that I like, the second thing that I want to say, which is that I think what Palestine teaches us is to center radical empathy. Mm-hmm. And here I think the weaponization of anti-Semitism to silence critique of Israel has meant that we turn away from that history. And I believe that actually we have to continue centering it and follow the long and honorable lead of Jewish anti-Zionists, in particular in this moment, JVP. And I think it's also really, really important to hold the history of the genocide of the Jewish people, which in Hebrew is Shoah, which means catastrophe, and the history of the Nakba, which also means catastrophe in Arabic, together, which is not to make them comparable or in any way parallel, because that's shallow and ahistorical, but rather to look at the Shoah and the Nakba together, to think about the centrality of catastrophe for both Palestinians and Jewish people. In this last sentence, I said Jewish, I didn't say Israeli. And here I think it's really important for us. The other lesson that this question brings to the fore is how much language itself is a product of history. And that we have to dismantle the languages that we've received. So earlier, when I was talking about 1917 and Palestinian Jews, the thing that happens is with European Jewish settlement coming into Palestine, that category of Palestinian Jews for the most part disappears from records, because it gets brought into the broader category of the Yishuv, what European Jewish people called themselves, the settlement community. So what I mean here by the question of language is, look at the binaries that we understand as crucial to the history of Palestine and Israel. And here I just want to look at two binaries. Jewish and Zionist, and Arab and Jewish. Jewish and Zionist are kind of have been taught to us as synonyms, but they are not, right? You can be Jewish and not a Zionist. You can be Zionist and not be Jewish. I know this sounds simplistic, but we still have to say it, right? Like, Judaism is the world's first Abrahamic monotheistic religion. It's 4,000 years old. Zionism is a nationalist political movement that began in the 19th century. It's really important to continue breaking down that seemingly synonymous categories. The second set is Arab and Jewish. And here I think it's really important for people to understand that basically until the 12th century, most Jewish people lived under Muslim and Arab rule. The category of Arab Jewish is a long historical one. In fact, there was a language called Judeo-Arabic, which was Arabic and Hebrew letters. And that is the language that figures like Maimonides, who's one of the most important Jewish philosophers, wrote in, right? When he lived in Fustat, which was Cairo at the time. And so it's really important to think about, and Palestine really invites us to think about the ways in which Arab Jewish became an impossibility. To be both Arab and Jewish became an impossibility as a result of these ethno-national conflicts, right? That category becomes an impossibility both because of Zionism and Arab nationalism. And we really have to reject those binaries. And then the last thing I'll say is, gets us a little bit back to children and storytellers. I think the question of the power of storytelling is one of the most compelling ones that Palestinians offer us. I think there's such a long Palestinian tradition of storytelling as a way not just to reflect history, but to shape it. And the people I rely on here are, historians like Rosemary Sayegh, who kind of first shaped the practice of oral history to tell Palestinian stories. And she reminds us that telling our stories is a way of living despite catastrophe, a way of perceiving the world and acting towards it. And here I think we got to keep listening to the storytellers on the ground in Gaza, veteran journalists. I mean, Wael Dahdouh is now in Qatar, but so many of us watched this veteran journalist as he lost so many members of his family and continued showing up to tell the story, to influencers turned journalists like Bisan Auda, to the youngest journalist in Gaza now, Lama Jammous, who is this wonderful 9-year-old who has 700,000 followers on Instagram and who is telling the story of what's happening in Gaza from the perspective of a child.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many examples, right, of the persistence of that steadfastness in this moment of like unreal torment, and that is there's in that some sense of, if not hope, wonder. Like, to think that life can persist in spite of that is unbelievable, and yeah, I share the sense that like, the story that will be told when this violence is stopped will matter. It will matter. It will determine, because now Israel is basically waging war like every 2 years. Like, it's now utterly banal, the war on this scale. The number that you cited, and we really didn't kind of dig into this, of something like $250 billion gifted to Israel from the United States, is part of that story that needs to be told. Like, this is a joint U.S.-Israel attack.
Absolutely.
And that needs to, I think, be part of the, as it were, the narrative. But I just, appreciate again the wealth of knowledge and just your ability to recount these stories for us, because I think at the very least, we need to continue paying attention, and we need to keep talking about what's happening, because there's enormous danger in allowing it to happen without eyes on Gaza, without concern.
Absolutely.
So I really, really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Well, I appreciate you. Thank you so much.